In order to think productively about U.S. national policy, I think it's useful to have a broader sense of how the federal government spends all of its money. So we'll examine both how the U.S. spends money and where it comes from. So in these lectures especially, you may want to pause and look more carefully at the data. So you can start by pausing here and taking a look at these charts. This chart now shows outlays, and that is spending or expenditures, all means the same thing, and also revenues or income, here since 2008. Notice that this isn't in dollar amounts, but shows us what federal revenues and expenditures are as a share of the total economy. And that's generally a more useful measure when we're comparing spending over time, right? So we'll return to this issue, but note for now that it's normal for the U.S. government to spend more than it raises, and historically it always has been. Notice how rarely it is that we've run a surplus, that is, raised more money in a given year than we have spent. All right, so this shows total spending for fiscal year 2022. Fiscal years for the federal government begin on October 1. So total federal expenditures were about $4 trillion. Now those expenditures are often broken down into two main categories: mandatory spending and discretionary spending. One way to think about mandatory spending is to think of it as automatic spending. These are expenditures that Congress does not vote on every year, but that happen as a matter of course. As you can see here, and now we're looking at fiscal 21, mandatory spending is largely Social Security and unemployment insurance, Medicare and other health spending, and with much smaller amounts, things like housing, some veterans benefits, and more. With these programs, the law requires that everyone who meets the eligibility requirements for the program gets the benefits, no matter how many people qualify in any given year. While Congress will try to predict how much these programs are going to cost, it doesn't set an annual budget the way it does for other programs. It doesn't allocate a fixed amount of money each year that the executive branch cannot exceed. Whatever mandatory programs cost is what they're going to cost, no matter how much they will cost. Here's another visual representation of these data. This is now looking at fiscal 2023, showing us a little bit more detail. And now here we see for the same year, fiscal 23, these same data as a share of GDP. Now we're looking at change over a 20-year period. What do you see here that you think is worthy of note? This is now projecting into the future rather than comparing with the past. Again, what do you see? Same idea broken down by area of spending. Again, anything you think of note? Why? So, that was a brief look at mandatory spending. Most of the rest of the budget is discretionary spending. And this is pretty much everything else that the federal government does. It's the FBI and the Park Service and Defense and Foreign Aid and the TSA and funding the presidency and Congress and courts and the USDA and the EPA and the FDA and FEMA and so on. When the Congress and president fight over the budget each year, this is typically what they're fighting about. Notice how much smaller the total amount is when we're looking just at discretionary. And again, here we're looking at absolute dollars versus share of GDP. Now we see trends over time, again, as a share of GDP. And here are the categories as a share of total non-defense, right? So we're taking out defense, non-defense discretionary. What are the biggest categories? Now, talking about defense, right, notice that we spend more on military expenditures than does any other nation on the planet. And in fact, we spend more than the next 10 countries combined, as you can see here. Now, the last major expenditure, looking at those categories, is interest on the total national debt. Because, as I've noted, we usually spend more money each year than we take in, we have to borrow it. And just as you pay interest on money you borrow, whether it's a bank loan or a credit card, so too does the government pay interest on the money it has borrowed. All right, and now finally, here we are once again looking at total spending for fiscal 2021 in this case, only now without distinguishing between discretionary and mandatory. We're putting it all together and breaking out the categories, right? So notice what the big three are. Nearly 3/4 of all federal spending is devoted to Social Security, healthcare, and the military. This is why one analyst described the U.S. federal government as an insurance conglomerate protected by a large standing army. That's not a bad description, I think, and one that's perhaps worth remembering.